Hi, welcome everyone. Hello, we're just going to leave it a few minutes or a minute or so just to make sure that we've got as many people as possible. Hi, Davinia. Hello, Laura. Hello.
Just unmute myself. Hi, Nicola. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Very well, thank you. Hi, Laura. Hello, Lucy. Hello. Lovely to see some new faces. Blanca, I don't think we've met you before, so nice to have you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hello, Andrew. It's a familiar face.
Hi, Nicola. You all right?
Hi, Lucy. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, long time no see.
Yeah. How's life treating you?
Oh.
You're in the office, so
Same as everyone else.
yeah.
Oops. Yeah, I'm fed up with it, but I am in the office today, so that's nice.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it, to get a break? Right, how many have we got in? 45. We'll just leave it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll make a start. Okay, it's 2 minutes past, so I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone. We're absolutely delighted that you could join us for the first event as part of our major programme this year, Building Recovery, Closing the Gap. I'm Nicola Mathers, I'm Chief Executive of Future of London. Shortly, I'm going to be introducing you to the overall programme and our speaker, Dr. Molly Morgan-Jones. But before I do, just a little bit of housekeeping, and we're going to ask you a poll question as well, which will just be very quick and simple and easy. So we'd like to make this a really as much of an interactive session as possible. So if you could change your screen label to your full name and your organisation so we all know who you are. If you haven't done already, if you go up on the right hand corner of your screen and select a gallery view, that means you can see everyone, and then when Molly's doing her presentation, switch to speaker view, which means you'll be able to see the slides in good detail. We'll ask you to keep yourself on mute until we get to the question and answer. But I really want to hear your thoughts and your reflections and your views as Molly's speaking, so please do use the chat function at the bottom to share what you think about what you're hearing, share your own experiences and what you're learning. We really want to encourage you to do that. If you want to at any point post a question in the chat box, then by all means do that, but as I said, we'll save those up for the Q&A at the end. Right, the poll should be coming up on your screen now, and the question is, do you feel optimistic about our recovery from COVID? Massive question, multi-layered, but just give us your gut feeling. And what we'll do is we'll then go to the poll after Molly's presentation and have a look at the results. So a brief outline of what we're trying to achieve through our Building Recovery, Closing the Gap event today and our programme. And the whole programme is made possible through the sponsorship from our partners, Arup, Countryside, Lewis Silkin, Montague Evans, Mount Anville and Paula Thomas Edwards Architects, many of whom are with us today. So we really appreciate your sponsorship to enable us to put on all these events for free. And with them over the next 9 months, we're going to be carrying out research and delivering a series of events which seeks to explore how the built environment sector can respond to recovery in a way that prioritises equality and fairness. And we know that COVID has highlighted and reinforced many of the structural inequalities in our society. So through this programme, we're going to be asking 3 things. Firstly, what do we mean by fairer cities and how do we measure it? What is stopping us from achieving this? And then who's doing really well at this and what can we learn from them? And that might be from London, it might be the UK, it might be overseas. And the first step is obviously understanding the context in which we're working within. The British Academy have recently published 2 reports, which is the product of an independent review involving over 200 leading experts to explore the long-term impacts of COVID and how we can respond. So I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce Dr. Molly Morgan-Jones, who is Director of Policy at the British Academy and has overseen this landmark research. Molly's going to give us an introduction to the key themes in the reports that relate to the built environment specifically, and then there will be time for your questions. And I really want to spend enough time at the end asking your questions, but obviously also you as a group of individuals have got an enormous amount of experience as well. So as I say, please do feel free to share that as we go through. Get involved in the chat function, and we're also using the hashtag on social media, hashtag closing the gap. Okay, so now it's over to you, Molly.
Great, thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have this opportunity to talk to you. As Nicola said, I'm the Director of Policy at the British Academy. We are the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. We represent disciplines ranging from history and philosophy to economics, law and psychology, and we work very closely with what we call our sister academies, so the Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering, which I think we may have some people on today who work with them, and the Academy of Medical Sciences. For us, we mobilize our humanities and social sciences disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future. And these reports I'm going to discuss today are a really good example of that. So I'm going to take you through just some very brief highlights of all the evidence that we pulled together in these reports and what some of our conclusions are. But I just wanted to focus on two things right from the beginning that have come out of our work. So first is that despite the strides we're making in tackling the pandemic today, in testing, vaccinating, social distancing, all of us working from home, the impact of COVID-19 is not coming to an end. A conclusion, which I hope is not a surprise to this sort of group, is that the social, economic, and cultural effects of the pandemic will cast a long shadow into the future. And it's going to emerge differently across different places, along different time courses, and differently for individuals, communities, regions, and nations. So that's why we say in the report we're facing a COVID decade. And this decade, like previous turning points in our history, will be defined by how we all come together, how governments, businesses, civil society, and individuals respond to the scale and complexity of what we're facing. And one of the things that we think is really important is that all of this is done, all of this thinking is joined up and interconnected. So the second main theme that I want to stress from the beginning is about integration. We approach these reports trying to integrate the evidence, and we think that some of the suggestions we've made about how we might move forward through the COVID decade and undercome them are all about kind of integrated ways of working together. A bit of a spoiler alert, I don't think I'm going to tell you much new today about impacts you aren't already aware of. Nicola's already given you one of them, exacerbating structural inequalities. And you're probably living through them, seeing them kind of firsthand throughout the pandemic in the types of organizations and work that you're involved in. But I do hope what we talk about and what's new is how we can integrate and connect the impacts in and connect them and think about how we work together to overcome them. And I hope we can leave with a sense of a blueprint of how you can start thinking about these integrated effects and what we can all collectively do together. I also just wanted to stress that I'm here to listen to all of your feedback and the questions and answers as much as you're listening to me for the next 12 minutes or so. And we are just at the very start of what we hope is a further ongoing program of work. We know there are a huge number of areas that we just weren't able to cover in the time that we were given to produce this report, but we do hope it's a foundation and a starting point. Okay, so on the reports, as Nicola said, in September of last year, Sir Patrick Vallance, who's the government's chief scientist, came to us and asked if we would produce an independent review. The question was simple: what are the long-term societal effects of COVID-19? But obviously very complicated to answer. So we did a huge amount of work, we synthesized and we looked across a lot of evidence, and we have these two reports as a result. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first report to start, which drew together all of the evidence that we reviewed and integrated. I'm going to go through it at a very high level and just give you a few small snapshots, but the report is written so you can dip in and out of it, and I hope it is of use to you. So if we can go to the next slide. So to start, we looked at impacts in the area of health and well-being, and each of the main section headings are the themes that you can see on the right-hand side, left-hand, depending on how you're looking at the slides. And across all this work, you can clearly see that the impacts of COVID on health and well-being have not been felt uniformly across society. We've exacerbated existing structural and social inequalities, and this has had particularly negative health outcomes that we've been seeing playing out across society, and in particular for those who were already in disadvantaged positions. So if we go to the next slide, just to bring that point to life, what you can see really clearly in this chart here is that the health outcomes of the pandemic in the immediate term have been worse for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or who have been most adversely impacted by economic shocks. So what you're looking at here is a breakdown by different age categories, and then the trend lines are showing people who are exposed to different levels of multiple deprivation. So the IMD stands for the Index of Multiple Deprivation, where Q1 is those who are experiencing some of the most deprived in societies. And we know that individuals in these circumstances have greater exposure to societal stressors, probably throughout their lives, which in turn may adversely affect immunity and increase their susceptibility to infection. So that's not only important for thinking about COVID and the current pandemic, but also potential future health crises that we might be facing. And it's also worth saying that I think there's still a lot of work to do to unpack and understand the different drivers of health inequalities and the effects that we're seeing. And it's pretty clear that it's no single variable explains it all. So it's not just about socioeconomic status, though that's a big factor. It's not just about poverty. It's not just about geography. It's not just about whether you work in certain sectors. It's definitely not just about race and ethnicity. There's deeper structural inequalities to think about. And there's a whole range of what we can think of as intersecting or intersectional inequalities that really need unpacking and grappling with to understand how we can overcome them. So if we go to the next slide. So here we've pulled together evidence in this chapter on communities, culture and belonging, and covered some of the themes that you see here. Again, hopefully good signposting to dip in and out. And a central theme across all of this evidence was the vital importance of community-led responses throughout the pandemic that really drew upon local knowledge and resources and built on capacities and connections that were already in place between different groups and communities in society, so government, community organizations, local businesses, and the public. And the evidence also shows that those communities that entered the pandemic with this kind of social infrastructure already in place have been in a good position to respond. And so I think there's a really key opportunity to take advantage of and learn from these experiences. So if we go to the next slide. One way of demonstrating this is some really interesting findings that we pulled together around feelings of national unity and local unity. Now, there's a lot going on in this slide. I'm going to try and talk you through it, but don't worry if you can't follow all the dots. But what we found, basically, the key takeaway is there is a valuable foundation of trust within local communities and feelings of local unity that are much more stable and stronger than feelings of national unity and feelings that people feel more divided. So what you see here is the chart depicts blue dots showing trends and feelings of local unity, so that's the lighter blue, versus feeling more divided, and that's the dark blue at local levels. And the gray dots are a similar pattern at the national level. So light gray is feelings of unity at a national level, and dark gray is more divided. And then we plotted this since December of 2019, and then there are some key milestones in the pandemic response highlighted. There's a lot to get your head around there, but it's really interesting data. But as you can see in the chart, perceptions of local unity, so the light blue trend line, are generally higher and more stable throughout the pandemic response, no matter what was happening with different decisions or factors that were going on in the different waves of the pandemic. And I think that's really important to reflect on and build on. If we go to the next slide, it's even more interesting when we look at patterns of trust. So the UK did enter the pandemic with historically high levels of political distrust. And you can see that trend line again going back to December 2019. But then again, if you plot it over the course of the pandemic, the blue line indicates those who indicate distrust in the government, and the gray those who do. And again, what we can see is while measures of trust saw a substantial rise at the onset of the first UK lockdown, so about a year ago now, these declined across the year to return to pre-pandemic levels. And even though it's not plotted on this graph, we did some follow-up work prior to the report being published, and we saw the same trends continuing through to March of this year. So even after the vaccination rollout, these patterns were still persisting. If we go to the next slide. So our final big area of work that we did was on knowledge, employment, and skills. And again, here we find, surprise, surprise, that COVID has had significant and unequal effects depending on where in the UK people live, their level of education, the type of employment, and the socioeconomic status. And again, the risk that COVID is exacerbating and widening a range of inequalities that were already there in the system but are now being compounded. If we go to the next slide, again, just to bring that point to life a little bit, we can see that this chart is showing us the regional distribution of different kinds of jobs correlated with high GDP or low GDP and the ability of people in those areas to socially distance. So again, bringing together a range of different ways of thinking about the data. And we can see that there are not only regional differences in economic resilience to the pandemic that you can see here in terms of ability to continue to social distance, but those regions that were hardest hit are those that were already suffering from low productivity, low levels of capital investment, and low GDP per capita. So again, shutting down large parts of the economy over the course of the pandemic, all of the associated changes to our lives are all going to be impacting these sorts of trends that were already there. And we need to really grapple with that and think about how do we not continue to accelerate those trends in the nature of our response. Now, if we go to the next slide, when we look across all of this evidence, we found 9 interrelated areas of long-term societal impact that we thought really came out. You'll have heard me repeat a lot of these words already, but they range from the widening and exacerbated inequalities, the increased importance of local communities, but strains on supporting them, and lost and likely unrecoverable access to education, training, and skills development. And this isn't just for children and young people, although of course they've been really hit by the lost access to education, but training and skills development throughout one's entire life and the ability to do that flexible shifting and moving through different careers that we're probably going to be seeing a greater need for as the economy might be shifting in the pandemic response. So these aren't exhaustive areas, but we think they're all important and they're going to require a coordinated response, which leads me to the second report, Shaping the COVID Decade. So if we go to the next slide. In this report, we really focus on bringing the evidence to bear against a set of 7 strategic policy goals for policymakers in a way, but really for all of us to pursue. And addressing them is going to require coordinated effort from all of us and actors across society. So I'm just going to highlight a few. We can go into more detail in the Q&A, and I'll discuss them one by one, but hopefully you'll begin to see how they start to layer. So if we go to the next slide. One of the first ones to call attention to is about building multi-level governance structures. Now, tensions between localized and central governance are longstanding, but I think the current crisis has brought much of this to the fore. And it feels to us, in looking across the evidence, like there's a clear justification and really a unique opportunity for a real thorough, bipartisan, transparent assessment and look at what those relationships and the role and powers of central and local government are. And interestingly, evidence from history suggests that very specific, resourced local and community knowledge is vital to combating and recovering from epidemics and other public health crises. So for example, the structural challenges of the swine flu epidemic, which wasn't all that long ago, and particularly the confusion between agencies at a local level have been shown when we look back to have hindered containment of the outbreak. So there's interesting parallels and we can learn going back in history, and we have a deeper dive on our evidence hub if you're interested in learning more about that. If we can go to the next slide. Here we think there's an important goal about strengthening and expanding community-led social infrastructure. So again, this idea that communities were really important to the pandemic and they're going to play a crucial role in rebuilding trust and cohesion. And we need to ensure the right infrastructure is in place. And again, the evidence showed the importance of civic institutions like universities, colleges, places of worship, museums, and sports clubs all need to act as supportive nodes in the underlying structures which support and empower communities. And there's a very big and long body of evidence showing that. And I think as part of this social infrastructure, we also need to tackle creating a more agile and responsive education and training system. And this is another one of the policy goals that we highlight in the report, because we're going to have a changing social and economic environment. And again, if we think about how we're regenerating towns and cities, which is the final policy goal I'll talk to. So if we can move to the next slide, we're going to need a range of skills that offer new educational and employment opportunities that help us transition the economy to sustainable growth. So the final goal I'll touch on is just this one about reimagining urban spaces to support sustainable and adaptable local businesses, amenities, and lifestyles. And again, it connects to all of the issues I've just been talking about. And I think we're all seeing in our daily lives, the pandemic is creating push and pull factors for migration out of cities and towns. The survey data that we've highlighted in the report, but there might be more up-to-date data by now showing that, at least 14% of Londoners want to leave the city, but maintaining urban density is actually a really essential part of creating efficient, economically productive, and sustainable towns. And it's also really important to note that density itself is not directly associated with the higher COVID infection rates. This is likely to be a result of the structural inequalities and other factors I've touched on. And in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that denser cities could be more resilient to future health crises if they are efficiently and equitably designed. So some interesting research to think about there. So just to bring all of this whistle-stop tour to a conclusion, we need to develop policy that really pays attention to all these interconnections and the impacts. If we just think about it piece by piece, I think we'll fail to deliver as much as it could. And I think one of the things that's also really important to reflect on in our work is that of history. History has shown us that pandemics are just as much social and economic crises as they are medical and health ones. But history also shows us that these times of upheaval can be opportunities to reshape society, but it requires all of us to have vision, to work together, to think about policy change, cultural change, social change, all in a connected way. So I'll stop there and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was really fascinating, and just feel like a whistle-stop tour through two huge research documents. And I expect we can send everyone the links to those documents as well in the follow-up, so that they've got the evidence as well. And it just listening to you talk, it's just so complicated, isn't it? Because everything is so related, and it just touches on just so many different factors. And there's no one solution, isn't there? Given that it depends on the people, the time scale, the place. It almost is a bit overwhelming, but I think what's been really useful for the work you've done is just pulling out those 7 areas which we can focus on. And I imagine everyone in the room today has got a role to play in one of those, or one or more of those ways. So I'll just kick off. So if you want to ask Molly a question, then by all means add your question into the chat. That would be great, including who you are and your organisation, and try and keep your questions succinct. That would be great. Or if you want to ask a question, then raise your digital hand or your physical hand, and then I will come to you, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. But I'm going to kick off with Chair's privilege of asking a few questions. So in terms of timing, I guess, is a danger that at the moment we're all obsessed with, getting through the roadmap and getting to the dates and making progress that way. Is there an opportunity really or is there the danger that we'll be just so concentrating on the here and now that we might miss the opportunity to affect change? I mean, for you, when does recovery actually start?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. And I'm not going to give you a roadmap of dates, but I guess I would say, I think recovery starts now, really. There are a range of things that we have to focus on today, but it doesn't mean we can't take our eye off of the horizon and where we want to get to. And I think, again, it is really important to reflect on, the foundations that already exist in a lot of places and in a lot of sectors. That's really important to think about and reflect on going forward. So yeah, I think there are actions that can be part of our response to the way we are navigating the system now that will also be part of the recovery.
Thank you. And given you obviously set out some really clear policy goals, which is really helpful, lots of local authorities who I would imagine in this have a big responsibility. It's not just sits on theirs, it's obviously national government, it's communities, as you've talked about, it's business. So how do we achieve these policy goals in the context of the fact that so many local authorities are under huge pressure due to resources, but also obviously due to money? So people and money, is such a big issue. So where do you see the opportunities? Maybe something that we've learned from history before, where we can actually sort of take these recommendations up.
Yeah, I mean, to borrow a phrase from the last campaign, I don't have a magic money tree that I can plan to fix some of these issues. But I think it is about recognizing some of these things aren't just about money, and they aren't just about local government doing things. So I think it's about understanding, how do we get all parts of the system working together in concert so that the sum is more than the whole of the parts. And I recognize that's easy to say sitting, in a room and on a screen like this. And you all on the call will know the firsthand realities of that much better than I do. But I think that's partly where I think that first goal about thinking about multi-level governance structures is really important, because there is an opportunity to rethink that and sort of start fresh and say, actually, we do need to think about that balance in the role, and that needs to go on, and that's a process that will play out, in Whitehall, so to speak. But I think that doesn't mean we have to stand still while that's happening. So thinking about what role can local businesses play, what are the different bits of your social infrastructure that are already in place that we can mobilize and help support and help build up, share the links and the knowledge about where there might be sources of resource, monetary or otherwise, that we can play a role in. So I think there really is this important step of understanding what all the different actors are at local and very hyper local levels. And there's a huge amount, as we found in this work, of resource to kind of build on, and it's partly about understanding where all that is and how we can tap into it.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Martina. Given that there will be pressures to go back to spending, how urgent is it that we change the goalposts and achieve real structural change? Is the decade working to our advantage?
It's an interesting question. I'm going to have to open up my chat, because I often do better when I can see the question. So I think I think the decade concept is important in that sense, because this is going to take time to change, and I think the aim is to think about changing the goalpost and the wider systems that we want to operate within. There's an important point about sort of that vision of what all of this interconnected activity can look like, and an awareness of how we join up all of those dots across different sectors and silos. I mean, conversations we've had with government officials about all of this, it's clearly very difficult. Government departments are big, big machines and big beasts. But I do sense a shift that people are really, they see that there is this real need to tackle. I mean, this isn't a new idea. But that there is an urgency to this, and there is a moment and an opportunity to be seized. I think there's another important element also about, it made me think of a question about the way in which we think about spending and returns on investment. I mean, I know we're seeing, I'm by no means an expert on Treasury policy, but we did have, changes in the way the Green Book is thought about. I feel like I'm hearing more about the importance of, thinking about value and not just a strict value for money and quantitative cost, benefit, but wider conceptions of value. We're hearing more and more the phrase of social infrastructure in daily lexicon. And I think that's all really important, because I think that signals there's an understanding of a shift that needs to happen.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go to Davinia Fenton from Countryside. Davinia, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks, Nicola. Wally, that was just fascinating. There was just almost too much information for me to review. But there's two bits I'm really interested in. So I work for a large developer who focuses on regeneration sites. And in the last couple of your slides, you were saying that there's going to have to be a lot more work in training and job creation, and also looking at regeneration opportunities, and that will have a big impact. Do you think that the government is going to be placing a lot more emphasis on large companies providing more jobs and trainings in the local communities in which they work? Because maybe there's some degree of influence at the moment, but I think that all companies could be doing more, especially at the moment with so many people unemployed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I can't speak for the government, but I do think that there is within communities that, so these sort of discussions that we have, I do think there's a growing awareness that this the emphasis isn't just about, more jobs and job centers, but we're really thinking about kind of the skills and the training that's needed. It's definitely an agenda that we've been working a lot on at the British Academy over many years, coming at it from the perspective of our disciplines and sort of what are the broader sets of skills that people who graduate with an arts, humanities, or social science degree can offer. I think there's a really important sort of connection here as well to, look at the education system across the piece and think about how it supports lifelong learning. I mean, if we look at FE colleges, they've experienced a 12% cut. I'm going to get my figures wrong over the last decade, or at least over the last few years. But actually those sorts of institutions can be important sort of nodes within communities and places, to connect, to find out about new jobs, new skills, and sort of develop that sense that, we are all learning throughout our career, and could be important points for businesses of all sizes to sort of be connecting into. So again, ways that we can think about how can different parts of a system that may not have otherwise interacted before kind of come together. I think in another program of work that we have on the future of the corporation, which is looking at how can businesses embed purpose and become more purposeful in the way that they operate. Again, I think this is a theme that's gaining a lot of traction, and thinking about what's the value they're bringing to a wider set of stakeholders. And I think this is skills and training is an important part of that puzzle that I certainly get the sense that more businesses are starting to think seriously about. But I'd be open, if you think differently, it'd be really interesting to hear if you've got different kind of sets of evidence.
I don't think differently. I think it's really important. And I think with the unemployment levels that we have, I'm hoping that all large companies are waking up to the fact that we have to do more. But as you said, it's that connection to actually the talent as well, to find out what opportunities they need and how we can actually work with them. And sometimes that's quite challenging to find those on the ground.
Yeah. So there's sort of a task there to be thinking about how do we help facilitate those connections, particularly for those who might just be starting and not quite sure kind of where to start. It's an interesting point to reflect on and think about, particularly for our work, what role we might help play.
Thank you. We've got a question. Oh, I've just lost the question now. From Elena at the Bartlett, which is the 15-minute city. So that's it, when you sort of have everything that you need at your disposal within 15 minutes, as a way to develop more sustainable towns and cities. Are there potential dangers of implementing this method? Could it reinforce divisions between communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably, and there was, I think in all of this, as we're, thinking about how we reimagine cities, there was some research which we pulled together, which we looked at in the report, which was about the sense of, as looking at especially new developments within cities and feelings of how that affects people who are already living in those towns. Do you get this sense of others coming in? And I think these are important things to reflect on, particularly as we're getting urban to rural migration at the moment. So I think, thinking about the ways in which we facilitate, understanding within communities that we don't create artificial divides because of where people are, is absolutely going to be important, and work that's that goes on around cohesion and trust, and how we build bridges across communities is going to be important. I mean, I think another element, and sorry if this seems a bit of a leap, is also, what communities and cities are definitely geographical, but communities aren't so much just geographical anymore. You can have digital communities, and you can have a whole range of thinking about ways people come together. So how can we build on some of the opportunities there, and might that be ways to help think about, if we've got more geographically constrained ways of living, which might have some benefits, how can we overcome those using other tools about the way that we're all working at the moment digitally?
Yeah, that certainly came up in a project that we did, actually, that Davinia was part of, called People, Place and Community last year, which was all about how can we build in social networks within, newly regenerated areas. And that was both physically so it was really interesting because it chimes with your research, physically building spaces, you know, that are accessible and welcoming to everyone. But the digital element was incredibly important. And that came through really, really strongly, particularly obviously when people were working online and at the point where people were, you know, are not happy to go outside so much. That was really, really important.
Yeah.
I've got another question from Dan Hill. Dan, are you happy to answer the question? Do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Thanks very much, Nicola. Thanks very much, Molly. It was really interesting to talk. Yeah, I suppose it was just a question about some of the sort of short-term responses that already happened from central government, which, you know, have basically been, here's a kind of thematic pot, Future Cities, Future Towns Fund, Levelling Up Fund. I mean, there's other things out there, and I'm sure there'll be more, where, and having recently, I was working till late last year at Newham Council in East London, where, you know, we would often try and bid for a lot of these projects. And what you ended up finding was that, you know, the sort of strictures around the funding, very short term, incremental, not strategic, the kind of criteria for which you had to bid against were very constraining. And I just, you know, this is, you know, as you say, it's a decade-long challenge, perhaps even more. The scarring of this might affect some people's job prospects for much longer than that. Isn't there a better way to think about how, given central government has controls of the money, frankly, or most of the money, is there a better way of engaging down in this devolution debate?
I mean, I feel like the answer has to be yes. But I think there's important things about, you know, how do we, okay, let's say we had to keep, you know, continue to work in the current system. Then what are the ways in which we can help support, you know, local governments to help bid into that money? And I've been on, you know, different calls, which, you know, people have been thinking about what are the sort of ways that that can be done, and help ensure that people can bid into things. I think again, there's probably a need to think about what are the range of, you know, how do all the different pieces come together to create that kind of joined up picture which shows what the real value is. I think I would come back to the kind of the first goal we put in the report, which is about really reassessing that whole system, which I think, you know, it has to be, you know, part of the starting point. And again, I know that's not a new idea, but it does feel like there's, you know, a moment now to and some headwind behind it, and clear evidence that shows that that's needed if we are going to rebuild and recover. I suspect there may be a need to really perhaps do some almost counterfactual research and what that evidence base is. If we didn't really seriously look at it, actually, what are these effects that could continue to get worse? And I don't like to paint our report in this way. You know, one way of reading it is there's a lot of really bad stuff that can continue to happen if we don't do something about it. And I suspect, you know, that goal about you know, getting that relationship right, so it doesn't come across in the way, you know, you've put in the chat, unfair and not working for the people, you know, that you'd like the money to be working for, really doesn't continue. Sorry, I don't have a magic answer, but
I don't think anyone has a magic answer, do they?
It's just, sorry to jump in, the devolution piece does feel very, very important, and the relationship between different layers is so important. And, you know, I think we have a very, very centralising government, even more so than a general, very centralised system that we all operate, certainly in England. So, you know, and we're coming up to mayoral elections next week, and we all know that the London mayor has, frankly, not much power. I mean, he has some power, which is great, but wouldn't it be better if there was more real debate around devolution, certainly in England?
Yeah. And also, you know, what does that mean, you know, particularly at kind of regional levels, not just kind of within the nations?
Thank you very much. Great question, Dan. I think we'll show the poll, shall we? Can we show the poll results? Because this is obviously, you know, this is such a hugely challenging topic, but let's see whether we feel optimistic. Isn't that positive? I think that's fantastic. That is good.
Really
That's
interesting.
really, really good. Yeah, I really like that. That gives me kind of hope. And as I said, I do think that every single one of us in the room has got some role to play in this kind of pathway towards recovery. So I do feel very, very pleased that we all feel so optimistic. Can we take Sally Neeshaw at Urbact? Did the research look at gendered impact at all? Molly, how do we make sure that gender equality is at the forefront so that a reimagined urban space is inclusive? And obviously there's been a lot on the news recently about safety and women's safety in public spaces. So yeah, did you look at gender at all when you were doing the research?
Yeah, no, I mean it did come across clearly from the evidence, and obviously one of the the clear areas is around the women's budget group does really excellent research on this. There are real strong evidence about the impacts of the pandemic on women for childcare reasons, carrying a lot of the burden, disproportionate impacts on women because of the nature of sectors that they might be working in, and so it came across definitely in a range of ways, which you'll see particularly in the evidence section of the reports, and in several different areas. And we always tried to look at the impacts on different groups, and there's a couple sections I think in the knowledge, employment and skills which really do try to break down different types of group, gender, intergenerational, people with disabilities, and a range of different ways of looking at it. I think this has to be a critical lens that runs without it, but I think what's also really important is sorry, I forgot who's asked the question. As Sally has said, it's not just about one type of inequalities, which is why we sort of, in the way we pulled together the 9 impacts, we had lots of discussions in the team is, should we highlight the impacts on women or should we highlight the impacts on young people? But I think it was this sense that all of these things are important to have a look at, but it's also, we need to understand how they all are overlapping and intersecting together. So, and particularly for those people in society that might be suffering from multiple types of inequalities, and how do we make sure that they're not falling through the cracks? One of the fellows that we worked with has a way of putting it where it's, how do we make sure we're always paying attention to the extremes, as and the distribution as well as the medians and the means. So I think all of that has to come in, and I think if we're thinking about inequalities in that broad way and constantly kind of connecting back to that, then the hope is that once we start to think about how we implement these different policy goals and the specific ways we might take them forward, I think that's one way to do it. And sorry, it's just reminding me, Dan, to come back. I mean, you can see my mind is swimming with all the different bits of the reports that are in there. We do have for each of the policy goals in the report a set of kind of what we call policy opportunities or ideas, really, that are about how do we take them forward in practice. So what are some very specific, if the goal is about multi-level governance, we then set out for each policy goal a whole specific set of ideas. They're just a starting point. They're a set of ideas that we might start to take forward. So that's worth taking a look at as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Can I go to Patrick? Patrick Devlin at PTE has got a question. Patrick, if you're there, if you can unmute yourself.
I can have a go.
Go for it.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Too much to get my head around at the moment. But as an architect, predictably, I'm really interested in how usable the current fabric of our cities is and I loved your hyper-local community format, term. How much does it need to change, do you think? And also, how important is the character and feel of it, as well as the space on the pavements and the low traffic neighbours and all the other things that we talk a lot about?
It's a really interesting an important question. I was just reading yesterday that a report from a place called the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge is looking at some of these issues, trying to bring together thinking about physical infrastructure with social infrastructure and the different threads. So a plug for them, the report I think will come out in the next few weeks. which, you know, I think isn't coming at your question in that way, but is making the point, we have to invest in both, and there are important kind of links and overlap in the way that the two both come together to create concepts of sort of what you might call civic value or sort of broader social value for those spaces. So again, I think this comes back to, you know, thinking about, you know, specific areas about what those urban spaces look like. How do we integrate green space within that? What does green space really mean? Is it about lots of, you know, big parks? Is it about small ones? How do different people in society interact with that? Again, in another project that we have at the Academy is on children and childhood. I can put a link to it because there's some really interesting thinking about there about how children interact with urban spaces that, you know, I think needs to be a part of this. So yes, absolutely. Again, another example of how I feel like I'm talking in general terms, which is perhaps helpful for people, but yeah, I think they have to be thought about hand in hand, because if you think about, you know, think like, okay, if our social infrastructure is important, how do people connect with institutions like, you know, their local community social enterprise hub, where there's probably a cafe, or maybe there's a library, or the schools, you know, how are those connected by roads? Are we you know, is it easy for people to get to them? If we're thinking about children, are we crossing lots of roads? Are we able to sort of move between those in a way that works for us as individuals, but also keeps sort of, you know, goods and services and other things flowing between them? And I think thinking about those, the social and the physical hand in hand have to be done together. If you'll allow me to sort of dip back into my own background, I come from a world of studying innovation policy, but from a social science perspective. And there's a really nice concept in innovation studies, which is about the physical aspect of technologies together with the social aspect. So, you know, the analogy would be, you know, you're baking a cake, you've got your recipe, you've got your flour, you've got your tools and ingredients, but how you put them all together, how you orchestrate around a kitchen to make sure they all come together at the right moment, and then what your infrastructure is and the environment are all going to be critical to having a delicious cake at the end. And I think the same principle can be applied here.
There's just one more bit to that, which is, I'll just mention it, sense of belonging. You know, that has a physical dimension. Yeah. You look around, and I belong in this place, and that's got to do a community. Sorry, I won't go on, but I think it's really fascinating.
And that's your role as an architect. Well done.
I was going to say care too feels like that's part of it, because if you feel that sense of belonging, then you feel care and responsibility for that community in both the physical and the social ways. Yeah, no, I think that's a really nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Alice.
Thank you. And yes, very interesting presentation, and lots of thoughts going on in my head, but I just wanted to comment on two things actually. And one is, whilst I think lots of people have this recognition that, yes, things must change because of what we've learned and around the inequalities, when it comes to it, you get back to that, what actually do people really want to change? And the example I give is around low traffic neighbourhoods, which is a sort of small example of where there was a response, a very quick response to some of the issues raised by the pandemic to try and improve the environment, make it better for people walking, etc., and being outside. And whilst not everywhere, there has been quite a considerable backlash against those from some people who don't like the consequences of the change happening that they may have been talking about and welcome in theory. So I just sort of wanted to float that one, because I think quite a few boroughs have reversed their low traffic neighbourhoods, and famously I think Kensington and Chelsea took out one of their main cycle routes. So that's something to watch, I think, about what happens there and whether that does, you know, result in significant change across our cities. The other comment is, in the context of London, I hate the phrase 15-minute city, because I think it should be 15-minute neighbourhood. Personally, I am so sick of the 15-minute radius around my house. I can't wait to get back into central London and as far away from my home as I possibly can. And I think in London, we need to get to the South Bank, you know, to the West End, to the City, to Covent Garden, to over to the Shoreditch, and you know, we need to travel around and use all those facilities. So I think this idea of 15-minute neighbourhood, which I think is right, and I think it's great that people are using their local shopping and services facilities more. But there are so many people in London who work in sectors which mean they can't work within 15 minutes of their home. The hospitality, the whole of central London. I mean, who lives within 15 minutes of central London? Not many people. And on a similar, sorry, I'm going on to my third point, but a similar thing is I think it's very easy, not everyone on this call, but certainly quite a lot of us, to see the pandemic and recovery from what I will call my privileged position, which is in a well-paid job, living in a house with a family and a garden, and job security. And I think, so all of this, working at home is fantastic. Well, not for a lot of people, it isn't. And I just think we need to be very aware of that when we're, making statements about the future and recovery, which suit me or you as an individual. It's not the same for everybody.
No, I think that's really important, and going into the pandemic, I think it's shifted a little bit over the past year, but I mean, the UK economy is 3/4, if not 80%, based on the services sector. And those are a lot of the sectors that have been, completely closed or fundamentally altered over the last year. And, that's an awful lot of people employed in those positions that haven't been able to work and are facing a lot of uncertainty, if not completely out of work now in how they recover. So that's why I think this idea about the how do we create a more agile sort of workforce, what are the investments we have to make, and I think this is a role for government to be thinking through. How can they help support large sectors of the economy sort of recover so that there is employment for people to come back into. I think another thing, it's another area where there's a real impact on young people. So many people, no matter where they're going to end up in life, get their start in hospitality or services, or first jobs working in a local shop. A lot of people put themselves through university in that way, and if those support structures aren't there for people, it's not only about income, it's about the softer skills that you gain from those experiences early in life. And I think then how do we help kind of replace those? And virtual and digital, is all well and good for those of us in sort of a more kind of knowledge-based economy. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It doesn't work for a lot of people. The data on that is pretty stark.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted our building recovery program to focus on the inequalities element, because it's certainly come from our members that there might be very well-intentioned programs, but this concern from the boroughs and others that they might not necessarily know the actual implications that that's having on the most vulnerable in society. So that's why we've got the focus of the program. So thank you for that question, Alice. We've got one question left, and I'm going to hand that over to Sam. So Sam, if you want to unmute yourself, you're from the Disability Business Forum, I believe. What's your question?
Business Disability Forum. Hello, everyone. Yes, so my point was just coming back to an earlier point, I think, raised by Molly. So I think a lot of the things around costs, because we're all worried about costs, obviously, is thinking about inclusivity from the earliest possible stage. So I've got a stat here about kind of the building of homes. So making adaptations to a typical home costs about 5 times more than it would be making kind of adaptable plans at a design stage. So if we get those kind of that thinking from the earlier stage, we might actually be saving money anyway. We just need to kind of consult widely and think about those wider kind of more vulnerable communities from the first instance, rather than trying to retrofit.
I think that's a really great point. And I think, again, when we think about kind of arguments that may or might not land with different government purse strings, so to speak, I think those sorts of points, are strong and powerful, and how we pull them together. If there's anything that, any of these threads, I was thinking I should say, we've got a lot of data on our evidence hub, but if there's any, academics or groups that are of interest for anyone, please, I'm happy to share my email, and do reach out, and I can help connect if there's any thinking you'd like to follow up on.
Sounds amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know some of you have said that there's just so much in this. So my colleague Ollie is now just going to put into the chat the link to the 2 reports from the British Academy. Molly said that she's happy for us to send you her presentation, so you'll get that as well. This event is being recorded, so you can come and watch bits of it again if you like, and obviously share that with your colleagues. I'll be doing a short write-up as well of the kind of main points. So there's lots of reflection time as well, and time to kind of get your head round and think, and come back to what we've been discussing as well in the future. obviously, Molly, thank you for such an amazing presentation. I think it's just covered so much, but it's been absolutely fascinating. A brilliant way to start our programme and really get us thinking about what the challenges are, but obviously helping us sort of shape them and focus them into the topic areas and issue areas that you identified, which has just been so helpful. So thank you for that. So I just wanted to let you know what's coming up next in our Building Recovery programme. So there's going to be a roundtable called The Scale of the Challenge and Opportunity, and that's on the 18th of May. Just in the chat now is the link, so if you wanted to sign up to that, you're very welcome to do that. We're going to be hearing across a range of professionals from the public sector, the private sector and the non-profit sector about what the urgent barriers are to achieving fairer cities. And through the discussion and the networking, you'll be able to have the opportunity to start forming connections and ideas about how we're going to overcome these very much shared challenges. And I think that's one of the big things that's come out of this discussion this afternoon. And speakers include the likes of the GLA, Friends of the Earth, and a number of London boroughs as well. So as I said, Ollie's just put the link in the chat there. You can link through to that. The other one we wanted to say is just save the date, because our big conference, which will be face-to-face, I really hope, is on the 26th of October. That's at the Hilton Hotel in London Bridge. So if you can note that in your diary, that's a full day event. And as I say, it would be great. And we really hope to be able to see you face-to-face. We will be sending you a brief feedback form, and we really appreciate the time. It takes just a few minutes just to give us some feedback on the event. We're continuously trying to improve how we run our events, so feedback from you is really, really helpful. Thanks again to Molly for a fantastic presentation and for being bombarded with lots of questions and answering them so eloquently. Thanks to everyone who asked a question for getting involved. That's fantastic. Thanks so much to my Future of London team for making it run so smoothly. So Hannah, Ollie and Tara, so thank you very much to you guys as well. And obviously to our sponsors, finally, Arup, Countryside, Lewis Silkin, Montague Evans, Mount Anvil and Paula Thomas Edwards. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy your evening, and I hope to see you on the 18th of May.